The Arizona desert stretched endlessly, painted in gold and bronze under the punishing sun. Heat shimmered on the horizon, blurring the line where earth kissed the sky. A dry wind whispered across the sand, carrying the scent of dust, sagebrush, and faraway smoke. In this unforgiving land stood a lone cowboy's cabin, a small, weather-beaten, and silent but for the restless creak of its wooden boards. Inside lived a man who had carved a life out of hardship, solitude his only companion. Each day bled into the next, and the desert seemed eternal, unchanging, until a knock broke the silence. The cowboy had been standing by his door, brushing the stubborn dust off his wide-brimmed hat. His horse, tethered nearby, shifted its hooves in the dry earth. When the sharp rap of knuckles struck the cabin door, the man paused. In a land where visitors rarely came, a knock could mean danger or destiny. Slowly, he opened the door, and his weathered eyes fell upon a sight he never expected. Before him stood an Apache woman, her chest rising and falling with ragged breath, her hair loose and wild like the desert wind, her gaze fierce yet pleading. Her lips trembled as she spoke, and though her voice was soft, it cut through the air with the weight of desperation. "Make me your wife, or I'll die a broken bar." The words seemed to hang in the hot stillness, stranger than any request he had ever heard. The cowboy froze, his hand gripping the door frame, every instinct telling him this was no ordinary plea. He saw the fear etched on her features, the urgency trembling in her hands. He didn't know her, but something in her eyes spoke of truth. He thought of shutting the door, of turning away from a problem that was not his. His life had been built on caution, every decision weighed against the dangers of the frontier. But as her gaze locked onto his, steady and unbroken despite the fear beneath it, he felt the sharp tug of fate. Her words weren't the cries of a liar or a beggar, they were the last defense of a soul standing on the edge of doom. Slowly, against reason but not against instinct, he stepped aside. With one firm motion, he reached out and drew her inside. The cabin door closed behind them with a dull thud that echoed in the silence. The dim interior, lit only by a flickering lantern, seemed to shrink around them. Shadows stretched along the rough-hewn walls, as though the cabin itself held its breath. The woman stood still, her back straight, her dark eyes scanning the room as if expecting danger even here. The cowboy studied her, taking in her torn garments, her dust-streaked skin, and the way her hands clenched as if ready for flight. Neither spoke at first. The only sound was the lantern flame crackling and the faint whistle of the desert wind outside. The air between them grew heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. The cowboy's mind raced. Why had she come to him? Why such a strange demand? And what threat loomed close enough to make her risk her life on the mercy of a stranger? His instincts told him trouble wasn't far behind. Trouble had already reached his doorstep. The Apache woman finally turned to him, her voice steadier than before though her eyes still betrayed her fear. "You don't understand," she said softly, almost a whisper. "If you don't take me in as your wife, I'll have no claim to safety. Alone, I am Plea, hunted by men who will not stop until I am gone." Her words carried the weight of desperation sharpened by survival. Each syllable carried the sound of a heart that had been running for too long. She wasn't asking for love, she was asking for life. The cowboy's jaw tightened, his mind caught between caution and compassion. He had built his life avoiding entanglements, yet here stood a woman on his threshold demanding the one bond that tied lives together. He could feel the heat of the desert pressing against the walls, the silence outside alive with unseen eyes. Somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps closer than he knew, danger was moving toward them. Her presence wasn't chance, it was the beginning of a storm he had no choice but to face. He studied her again, noticing the bruises at her wrists, the dust caked to her feet, the way her chest rose with each measured breath. This was no act, she had fought her way here, every step carrying her closer to his door. In that moment, he realized he could turn her away, but the desert would swallow her, or worse, men would find her, and if that happened, her blood would be on his conscience. Something deep inside him, something he thought long buried, refused to let that happen. The lantern flame flickered as the wind pushed against the cabin walls. The woman stood still, waiting for his decision. He reached for his chair and set his hat down, his eyes never leaving hers. "You'll stay here," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "But understand, woman, once you walk into a man's life this way, Nothing stays the same. His words weren't a promise of love or trust, but a vow of protection, carved from necessity and born of the frontier's harsh truth. She nodded, silent, but in her gaze was relief, fragile yet certain. The cowboy stepped to the window, peering into the darkness beyond the fading light. The desert night was falling, shadows stretching long, hiding secrets within their folds. Out there, he thought, men could already be closing in. He didn't know who they were or why they hunted her, but he knew enough of the land to recognize the pattern. When the hunted appear at your door, the hunters are not far behind. He gripped the edge of the wooden frame, his heart steady, his mind preparing for what was to come. Behind him, the woman lowered herself into a chair, exhaustion finally settling into her bones. She glanced around the cabin, seeing the life of a man carved from loneliness, simple, worn, functional. There were no comforts here, only tools of survival. The shotgun propped in the corner, the saddlebags by the door, the tin plate still holding crumbs from the cowboy's last meal. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. For her, it was safety. For now. She closed her eyes briefly, but sleep did not come. Fear still clung to her like a shadow. The cowboy turned back, watching her. He saw not just fear, but strength to cross the desert, to reach his door, to ask for the impossible. She was no ordinary woman. She carried with her the wildness of the land, the spirit of survival etched into her very being. He had lived long enough to know that such people didn't come into your life by accident. The desert didn't deal in accidents, it dealt in fate. He sat down across from her, the silence between them shifting, no longer empty but heavy with unspoken understanding. He thought of the words she had spoken, "Make me your wife, or I'll die." They were strange, urgent, almost unbelievable. Yet in her eyes, there had been no deception. It was the frontier where law was thin, and names carried little weight. Survival sometimes demanded bonds forged in moments, not years. If men hunted her, calling her his wife could be the shield that kept her alive. And perhaps, he thought grimly, it would force him to stand where he had stood alone for too long, between death and another life. The lantern flickered again, casting shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carried by the wind. The cowboy's hand instinctively reached for the shotgun leaning nearby. Danger was close. He didn't need her to explain the details. He didn't need to know the names of the men who hunted her. All he needed was the truth. He already felt it. Tonight would not pass quietly. Tonight, the desert would test him, and her, and whatever strange bond fate had just woven between them. And so they sat, two strangers drawn together by desperation and circumstance. The cowboy's eyes stayed sharp, watching the window, while the Apache woman's breathing steadied, though her body remained tense as a bowstring. They didn't speak again, not yet. Words were not what bound them now. What bound them was the silent knowledge that life had changed the moment she knocked on his door. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but both felt it. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. Night wrapped the desert in a cloak of silence, the kind of silence that seemed alive, waiting. Inside the small cabin, the Apache woman finally found her voice. Her words cut through the stillness, steady yet heavy with fear. "Men are hunting me," she confessed. "If they find me alone, I won't live till morning. But as your wife, I'll have protection, a broken bar and a chance to survive." Her confession was not a plea for love, nor comfort. It was a plea for existence, and in the raw edges of her tone, the cowboy heard only truth. The cowboy's eyes narrowed as he studied her. He was not a man of many words, nor of quick trust, but survival was something he understood better than most. The frontier had taught him that life was fragile, easily snuffed out by violence, hunger, or thirst. Reaching for the shotgun resting in the corner, he checked the chamber with the ease of habit. The click of metal was sharp in the quiet room, a sound of both warning and promise. He moved toward the window, scanning the horizon, his instincts already whispering that danger was close. Outside, the night was not empty. Faint shapes shifted beyond the edge of sight, their movements deliberate and patient. Too many to be coyotes, too cautious to be travelers. His jaw tightened. Whoever hunted her had tracked her well, following her to his door like wolves trailing blood. For a moment, he watched, his finger brushing the trigger guard, but he did not fire. Not yet. Shooting too soon would announce his position. And in the desert, patience could mean the difference between life and death. He turned back to her, his voice low, steady, certain. If you're mine now, then you're not standing alone. His words were simple, yet they carried a vow carved from iron. He was not a man who promised lightly. The woman's gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time since she had entered his cabin, relief flickered across her face. It was not joy, nor comfort, but the kind of relief that came from knowing she would not face her fate alone. In the harsh silence, it meant everything. The desert outside seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the storm was about to break. Wind whispered through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying with it the smell of smoke and gunpowder faintly lingering in the air. The cowboy had known many nights like this, where the line between survival and death grew razor thin. Yet something about this night was different. This wasn't only his fight anymore, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He had taken her burden onto his shoulders, and now her enemies were his. The Apache woman sat still, her posture tense yet composed, like a hawk ready to strike. She had run hard and far, but there was no weakness in her presence. He saw the scars of a fighter, a survivor, someone who had faced death before and would face it again without hesitation. Still, beneath that strength, her eyes revealed exhaustion, and the shadow of fear. She wasn't asking him to be her savior, she was asking him to be her shield, to stand beside her when the desert turned hostile. The cowboy adjusted his hat and glanced back through the narrow window slit. The figures in the distance had stopped moving. They were waiting, watching. He knew this kind of patience. It belonged to men who hunted not with desperation, but with confidence. They believed the night belonged to them, and that sooner or later, their prey would make a mistake. He had spent too many years in the wilderness to fall into that trap. If they were waiting, so was he. The desert had its own rules, and he had long since learned them. He returned to the table, set the shotgun down with an easy reach, and lit another lantern. The flame grew, chasing shadows back into corners, revealing the tired lines in his face and the quiet fire in hers. Neither spoke. Words, at this moment, would only weaken the resolve that had silently bound them together. Instead, they listened to the desert wind, to the faint crunch of boots far outside, to the restless shifting of men who thought themselves hunters. But the cowboy knew better. Tonight, the hunted had found a wall to stand behind. Time dragged slowly, each minute stretching long. The cowboy remembered his days driving cattle through wild country, nights when coyotes circled the herd and men circled the fire. He remembered ambushes and canyon passes, the sharp echo of rifles fired from unseen cliffs. The desert always demanded a price. He wondered now what price it would ask of him, and whether he was willing to pay it. His eyes flicked toward the woman again. She sat still, her dark hair catching the lantern glow, her expression unreadable yet strong. He had already chosen. At last, the silence cracked. From outside came a low whistle, sharp and deliberate. A signal. The cowboy's hand slid to his shotgun. His pulse did not quicken, his breathing did not change. He had faced too many dangers to let fear guide him now. But his muscles coiled, ready. The woman stiffened, her hand brushing the table's edge, as though ready to spring to her feet. He met her gaze and gave a slight nod. Whatever came through that door, through that window, through that darkness, they would face it together. The whistle was answered by another, closer this time. Shadows moved again, no longer cautious but bold, drawing nearer to the cabin. The crunch of boots on dry earth carried clearly now, matched by the faint jingle of spurs. The cowboy positioned himself by the window, shotgun steady in his grip. He could see them now, 5, maybe 6 men, their outlines dark against the moonlit sand. Their movements spoke of confidence, not recklessness. These were men accustomed to hunting, men who had killed before. But tonight, they had chosen prey with teeth. The woman rose from her chair and stepped closer, her voice low, urgent. They will not stop. If they take me, they will kill you too, to silence you. There was no tremor in her tone, no plea, only fact. She knew their kind better than he did, and she was certain of their cruelty. The cowboy's lips pressed into a thin line. Then they'll find the price higher than they thought. He glanced at her, and for the first time, a spark of something more than survival passed between them and understanding. perhaps even respect. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. Silence again, heavier than before. Then a rough voice called out, "Send her out, cowboy. Ain't no quarrel with you. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way." The words carried false promise, their edges sharp with threat. The cowboy's grip on the shotgun tightened, his jaw set. He had heard men like this before, men who spoke of peace while preparing to kill. He turned his head slightly, catching the woman's eyes, and whispered so low only she could hear, "Stay behind me." The next moment, the night exploded. The door shuddered as fists slammed against it, the wood groaning under the force. A gunshot cracked through the darkness, shattering the cabin window. Splinters of wood and glass flew, the lantern light trembling. The cowboy didn't flinch. In one motion, he leveled his shotgun and fired through the window. The blast roared, echoing across the desert, followed by a man's scream cut short. Silence returned, brief and deadly. The hunters had found their prey willing to fight, and the desert had no mercy for hesitation. Smoke filled the cabin, the sharp scent of gunpowder mixing with the dry desert air. The woman crouched low, her eyes never leaving him. She had seen men fight, had seen blood spilled, but there was something different about this cowboy. He fought not with recklessness but with measured precision, every movement calm and deliberate. He was not only protecting her, he was staking his ground, declaring to the darkness that this cabin, this moment, would not be surrendered. Her fear eased, replaced by a strange and unexpected trust. Outside, voices rose in anger. "He's just one man." One snarled, "Rush him." The cowboy reloaded quickly, his motions efficient, practiced. He had stood against numbers before, and numbers had never frightened him. He leaned against the wall, breathing steady, eyes sharp. The woman's hand brushed against his arm, grounding him for the briefest moment. She said nothing, but her presence was enough. Whatever storm raged outside, inside the cabin there was now unity. Two strangers, bound by survival, by choice, by a vow spoken not in church but in the face of death. The night would not end quietly. The storm had broken, and both knew it was only the beginning.